Why would any man here waste a dance on her? Brad Carmichael said it loud, on purpose, pitched to carry over the orchestra and bounce off the high ceiling of the ballroom and land in every corner of the room. He raised his champagne flute as he said it, and the light from 3 chandeliers caught the rim, and 5 of his friends laughed. The way young men laugh when they are relieved that someone else has said the cruel thing first. Eleanor Vandermeer, 18 years old, sat in her wheelchair at the edge of the dance floor and did not move. A single tear traced the line of her jaw and disappeared into the silver collar of her gown. Her mother, standing behind the chair, pressed both hands over her mouth and made a small, wounded sound that no one but Eleanor heard. 400 of the wealthiest people in the state of Georgia killed or tossed with their drinks at chest height and watched an 18-year-old girl be publicly destroyed at her own birthday ball, and not one of them stood up. Then a quiet man at the back of the room, a man no one had been able to place all evening, a man some of them had assumed was staff, set down the glass he was holding and began to walk across the floor. There is a kind of cruelty that only happens in beautiful rooms. It needs the chandeliers. It needs the orchestra and the champagne and the 400 witnesses in their tailored silence, because cruelty in a beautiful room gets to feel like manners. Hold on to that. It matters later. But let me take you back 3 weeks, to a gray afternoon in Savannah, Georgia, and tell you how a man who was not on anyone's guest list ended up being the only person in that ballroom who mattered. Marchmont Hall stood on a bluff above the Wilmington River, a white-columned house from 1838 that had survived a war, 2 hurricanes, and 6 generations of a family that had learned to treat money the way other families treat weather, as something that simply happened and always would. The Vandermeers had owned it for 90 years. Theodore Vandermeer III, the current head of the family, sat on the boards of 3 banks in a hospital system. And he was, by the measure the world uses for these things, a powerful man. He was also, on the gray afternoon our story begins, a frightened one, though he would not have used that word, because men like Theodore did not. His daughter had stopped speaking again. 2 years earlier, Eleanor Vandermeer had been the brightest thing in Savannah. She rode competitively. She danced ballet since she was 4, well enough that her instructor had used the word someday in a way that made Margaret Vandermeer's heart climb into her throat. She was the kind of 16-year-old who walked into a room and rearranged it just by arriving. And then, on a clear October morning at a riding event outside the city, her horse had spooked at a low rumble of thunder, and Eleanor had gone over the rail, and her father had reached her 36 letter and found her conscious and calm and unable to feel her legs. The doctors came after that, the way doctors do when a family has the kind of money the Vandermeers had. Theodore spent a fortune. He flew specialists in from Baltimore and Cleveland and Stockholm. He bought 10 second opinions and third opinions and ninth opinions, and every one of them, after the scans and the consultations and the careful pauses, said a version of the same sentence. The injury to the spinal cord was complete. There was no surgical path back. The kindest thing now was to help Eleanor adjust to a life that used a wheelchair. Eleanor stopped speaking for the first time after the 4th opinion. She started again, eventually, but something had gone quiet in her that the words did not bring back. She stopped riding. She stopped dancing, obviously, and the obviously was the cruelest part, the way the world had folded, dancing into the list of things that were simply over now, as if her body had been the only instrument she played, as if the wanting had died with the walking. It had not. That was the thing nobody around her understood, and the thing she had stopped trying to explain. The wanting was still there. It sat in her chest every time the orchestra tuned up at some event her mother dragged her to. Every time she watched couples find the beat and let it carry them. She still heard the music the same way. Her body still answered it somewhere below the surface, in a place the injury had not touched. She just had nowhere to put any of it anymore, and a person with nowhere to put their wanting learns, eventually, to sit very still and let the world believe the wanting is gone. When Margaret proposed the 18th birthday ball, Theodore resisted. 400 guests, the orchestra, the silver gown, the whole performance of a debut. He thought it would hurt her. Eleanor resisted harder, for the same reason. But Margaret had begged, with tears standing in her eyes. Please, sweetheart. Just one night, just to remind the world that you are still here, and Eleanor had said yes, not because she believed it would remind anyone of anything, but because her mother was crying, and because some small stubborn emperor of her still wanted to be invited back into her own life. To be invited back into her own life. The afternoon of the ball, Margaret had spent 2 hours on her. She arranged Eleanor's dark hair into a French chignon, fastened pearl drops to her ears, smoothed the silver silk over her daughter's motionless knees, and the whole time she narrated a hopeful future. Eleanor did not believe in the people who would be there, the old friends, the boys who used to call. Eleanor had watched her mother's face in the mirror and understood, with the particular clarity of someone who has stopped being able to lie to herself, that the ball was not for her. It was for Margaret. It was a mother's attempt to restore something that could not be restored, to throw a party big enough and bright enough to drown out the grief. And Eleanor had agreed to be the centerpiece of it because she loved her mother, and because she could not find the words to explain that being displayed was not the same as being seen. You look like a queen, sweetheart. Margaret. Margaret had tried to smile. The smile had not reached her eyes because she already knew, with the grim foresight of experience, more or less how the night would go. She knew the orchestra would play, and the couples would pair off, and she would sit at the edge of the floor in her beautiful gown like a portrait of a girl rather than a girl. And people would be kind to her in the careful, glancing way people are kind to the chronically unwell, and no one would ask her to dance. Because in the grammar of a room like that, the wheelchair was a full stop at the end of a sentence about her, and si Italian box, opera. And you did not ask a full stop to waltz. She had been right about all of it. That was the worst part. Sitting there as the first waltz began, and the boys found their partners, and her mother crossed the floor toward Andrew Pierce. She had been exactly right, and being right about your own erasure is a particular kind of loneliness, because you cannot even be surprised by it. You can only sit very still in your silver gown and watch the thing you predicted arrive precisely on schedule, and try not to let 400 people see it land. She did not know that the man who would prove her prediction wrong was, at that exact moment, slipping in through a door at the back of the room, unannounced, on no one's list, reading the room from its edges the way he had been taught to a quarter of a century before. She did not know that the senators, no, the wealthy man's son, who had once been her boyfriend, the boy who had stopped visiting her hospital room after the second week, was already somewhere in the crowd, late on purpose, rehearsing in his head the cruelest sentence anyone would speak in the state of Georgia that year. She only knew the count. 1, 2, 3. 1, 2, 3. Her hand kept it on the armrest without her permission, the way it always did when there was music, the old reflex of a body that had been a dancer's body before it was this, and she pressed her palm flat against the silver silk to make it stop, because keeping time to music you would never again be invited into was its own small torture, and she had enough of those as already. The ballroom of Marchmont Hall, on the night of January 24th, looked like something out of an old novel. 3 chandeliers shipped from Paris before the Civil War burned with a soft golden light over a parquet floor laid by hand when the house was young. Magnolia blossoms floated in crystal bowls along the perimeter. A 12-piece orchestra in white tie tuned beneath an oil portrait of the first Vandermeer to own the place. 400 guests, bankers and surgeons and judges, and 2 former ambassadors, and the wife of a sitting senator, drank champagne from etched flutes and pretended, with the practiced grace of the very rich, that they did not notice the girl in the silver gown at the edge of the dance floor. Now let me tell you about the man, because he is the reason any of this happened, and because the 400 people in that ballroom got him completely wrong, which was the whole point. His name was Keanu Reeves. He was 59 years old, and he was, by any measure the world uses, one of the most recognizable men alive, though you would not have guessed it from the way he was dressed when he slipped into the back of Marchmont Hall that night, in a plain dark suit that had clearly been worn before, with no entourage, no announcement, and a quiet about incorrectlet, as the quiet abouts of a man who did not belong. As the quietness of a man who did not belong. He had come because of a letter. The letter was from a woman named Vera Holloway. Vera Holloway was 81 years old, and 40 years earlier, she had been one of the most respected dance coaches in the country. A Vienna-trained ballroom specialist who had, in the second half of her career, done something almost no one in her field had done. She had pioneered adaptive ballroom in the United States, the discipline of partner, dancing with people who used wheelchairs, who had spinal injuries, who had been told by everyone else that dance was a country whose borders were now closed to them. Vera had spent 30 years proving that the borders were a lie, and once, a long time ago, she had taught Keanu Reeves. It had started as research for a role, a film about a dance instructor that had been made and forgotten, the kind of project that vanishes without a trace except in the life of the actor who took it seriously. Keanu had taken it seriously. He always did. He had gone to Vera for 6 weeks of training and had stayed, in a sense, for the rest of her life. Because Vera Holloway did not teach you steps. She taught you a way of paying attention to another human being. And that was not a thing you gave back when the film wrapped. They had stayed in touch for 25 years. He called her on her birthday. She sent him sharp, funny letters in a hand that got shakier each year. The letter that brought him to Savannah was shakier than the others. Vera was being honored at a charity ball. She wrote, "A debut for some rich family's daughter," the kind of event she normally would not have crossed the street for. But the family had a connection to her work. The girl had been her student once, years ago. Before an accident, Vera did not have the heart to describe in a letter. "Come if you can," she had written. "I would like to see your face in a room one more time before the rooms run out. Don't make a fuss. Don't tell anyone. Just come and sit in the back and let an old woman know you're there." So Keanu came, and he did exactly what she asked. He told no one. He arrived without a name on any list, slipped in at the edge of the ballroom, and stood near the back where the staff moved with their trays. And because he was a quiet man in a plain suit, standing near the staff, several of the 400 guests glanced at him and made the small automatic judgment that the very rich make about anyone they cannot immediately place, and looked away and forgot him. He did not mind. He had spent a good portion of his life being looked at, and there was a deep relief in standing in a corner of a beautiful room and being, for once, no one at all. He scanned the crowd for Vera and could not find her yet. He took a glass of water from a passing tray, and he watched the room the way Vera had taught him to watch a room, which is to say, he watched the edges of it. The places where people are placed when a room has decided they are not the point. That was how he saw the girl in the silver gown by the orchestra before anything happened to her. She was beautiful, and she was sitting very still, and she was watching the dance floor with an expression Keanu recognized immediately, because he had worn it himself in certain seasons of his own life. It was the expression of a person who is in the room, but has been quietly assigned to the category of furniture, and who has decided that the safest thing is to agree with this assignment. She watched the dancers the way you watch something through a window you cannot open. Keanu watched her for a while. He did not know her name yet. He did not know about the horse or the doctors or the 4.5 opinions or the wanting that had nowhere to go. He only knew what Vera had taught him to see, which was that the most interesting person in any room is almost never the one the room is looking at. The first waltz began. Couples paired off across the parquet floor, and Keanu watched the girl's mother bend down to her ear and say something, and watched the girl catch her mother's sleeve and shake her head, and watched the mother cross the floor anyway toward a tall blonde boy at the edge of the crowd. What happened next took about 15 minutes, and it was one of the ugliest things Keanu Reeves had ever watched happen slowly. The mother asked the blonde boy first. His name, Keanu would learn later, was Andrew Pierce, and he was the son of a man who ran a brokerage downtown. And he had known Eleanor since they were both 9 years old at the same swim club. Andrew looked over Margaret's shoulder at the girl in the wheelchair, at the girl he had once spent a whole samsasa racing in the deep end. And he looked at his shoes, and he said something about having already promised this one, and he found a different partner within the minute. He had not promised anyone anything. He simply could not bear, at 18, to be the boy seen dancing with the girl in the chair, because at 18 the worst thing in the world is to be seen doing the wrong thing, and the room had not yet told him that dancing with Eleanor was the right thing. And Andrew Pierce did not have the spine to decide it for himself. The second boy was named Christopher Wells, and he rubbed his wrist and murmured something about a lacrosse strain, and danced the next song with a redhead from across towns. And the wrist gave him no trouble at all the entire rest of the evening. The third boy, Henry Aldridge, discovered an urgent phone call from his grandmother and stepped onto the terrace, where Keanu, from his angle near the back, could plainly see him standing alone in the dark, not talking to anyone, looking at his own reflection in the glass doors, and then looking away from it, because even Henry could not quite stand to watch himself do what he was doing. A fourth smiled and promised the next song, warmly, charmingly, the way boys raised in houses like these are taught to make a refusal feel like a gift, and there was no next song. By the fifth refusal, the room had begun to do the thing that rooms do. The whispers started. A woman at a nearby table leaned to her husband and said, "Look away. Don't make it worse," which is the sentence cowardice uses when it wants to feel like tact. A girl who had once been tutored in French by Eleanor, back when Eleanor still did things like tutor people, held a napkin to her mouth to smile. The headmaster of the academy, half the young people in the room attended, studied the orchestra with great interest. And through all of it, the girl in the silver gown sat with her hands going white on the armrests of her chair, staring down at the silver hem of her gown, willing herself not to break in front of 400 people. What none of these boys knew, what the whole laughing room did not know, was that 2 years ago, any one of them would have crossed a crowded gymnasium to dance with Eleanor Vandermeer. She had been, before the fall, exactly the kind of girl this room produced and prized, brilliant and quick and a little untouchable, and half the boys now inventing wrist injuries had once daydreamed about her. The chair had not changed who she was. It had only changed what the room was willing to see, and the speed of that change, the totality of it, the way 2 years had turned the most wanted girl in the room into a thing people invented excuses to avoid, was its own quiet horror. And Keanu, watching from the back, understood it completely, because fame had taught him the same lesson from the opposite direction. He knew exactly how fast a room could decide what you were now, regardless of what you actually were. He had just never seen it done to someone with no way to walk out. Keanu set down his water glass. He had not found Vera yet. He did not know that the old woman he had come to see was, at that moment, being wheeled in, late through a side entrance by an attendant, that she would arrive in time to see what he was about to do, and would weep at the sight of it. He only knew that he was watching a room full of powerful people agree, by their silence, that a girl was furniture, and that he was the only person in the room who had not signed the agreement. And then the blonde boy's friend arrived, the one who had been late on purpose, and raised his champagne flute, and said the thing about wasting a dance, and the laughter broke across the room like glass, and the girl's mother made her small, wounded sound, and 400 people held their drinks at chest height and did nothing. Brad Carmichael was 19, and he had dated Eleanor Vandermeer for most of a year before the accident. That was the part the room mostly knew, and the part that made the cruelty land harder. What the room did not know was the shape of it from the inside. Brad had visited her in the hospital twice in the first weeks, once with flowers and once with nothing. And then he had stopped, and he had stopped for reasons that were almost banal in their cowardice. His friends had started to needle him about it. His father, a man who measured everything in terms of advantage and liability, had said to him quietly one evening that a young man with Brad's future did not need to be tied to a situation like that, using the word situation the way you would use it about a bad investment. And Brad, 19 and weak in the specific way of young men who have never been told no by anyone who mattered, had let the visits lapse, and then let the calls lapse, and had told himself a story in which Eleanor had pushed him away, which was easier than the true story, in which he had simply not been brave enough to stay. The cruelty in the ballroom, then, was not really about Eleanor at all. It was about Brad. It was the loud, ugly overcompensation of a young man who needed very badly for the room to agree that the girl in the chair was nothing. Because if she was nothing, then leaving her had cost nothing. And if leaving her had cost nothing, then he was not a coward. He was just a realist. The way his father was a realist. He needed 400 people to laugh so that he would not have to hear the quieter thing underneath the laughter, which was the truth about himself. That is what most cruelty is, if you watch it closely enough. It is a man trying to drown out something he cannot stand to hear about who he has become. Keanu did not know all of this yet, standing at the back of the room, but he knew the shape of it. He had been around long enough to recognize a man performing his own worst self for an audience. And he had learned that the only response that ever truly defeated it was not a louder cruelty in return. It was to simply, calmly, do the kind thing the cruel man had insisted could not be done, in front of everyone, and let the contrast speak. Keanu removed nothing dramatic. He was not wearing serving gloves. He was not staff, whatever the room had decided. He simply set his glass on the nearest tray, and he straightened his worn dark jacket, and he started to walk. He crossed the longest 40 feet of that ballroom, while the orchestra played a soft Chopin nocturne. The conductor had chosen to paper over the silence. Brad Carmichael's laughter had left behind. Every table he passed turned to watch him go, one after another, like wheat bending in a wave. Nobody knew what they were watching. They only knew they were watching something, which is the way it always is the moment before a room finds out it was wrong about a person. Brad Carmichael stepped into the aisle to block him, his lacrosse friends fanning out behind him like satellites. "Where do you think you're going?" Brad said. He looked Keanu up and down, the plain suit, the unfamiliar face, and arrived at the same conclusion the rest of the room had. "The kitchen's that way, friend." Keanu stopped and looked at him and did not answer the way Brad expected, which was to say he did not flinch and he did not bristle. He just looked at the young man for a moment with an expression of something close to patience, the way you look at someone who is going to be very embarrassed later and does not know it yet. "Excuse me," Keanu said, and he stepped around Brad the way a river steps around a rock. Brad's hand shot out and caught his arm. "I'm talking to you." Keanu looked down at the hand on his arm, and then back up at Brad, and for the first time that night, something in Brad Carmichael's face flickered. The small animal warning a man gets when he has grabbed hold of something he has badly misjudged. Keanu did not pull away. He just waited, calm until the hand let go on its own, which it did. He kept walking. He reached the wheelchair and he knelt. Not stooped, not bent at the waist the way you bend toward a child, but lowered all the way down to her exact eye level, one knee on the parquet floor, so that he was looking up at her, not down. The girl did not lift her head. Her tears had made dark spots on the silver silk over her knees. "My name is Keanu," he said. His voice was low, and there was no pity in it anywhere, which was the thing she noticed first, because she had become an expert in pity. And this was not it. "I'm sorry for what they said, for all of it. And I'm sorry it took somebody this long to come over here." She still did not look up. When she spoke, her voice was barely there. "You don't have to do this. Whatever this is. I don't need anyone to feel sorry for the girl in the chair." "I don't feel sorry for you," Keanu said, and something in the flatness of it, the plainness, made her head come up a few degrees. "I watched you for the last 20 minutes. You weren't watching those people dance because you wanted to be rescued. You were watching the way a dancer watches, counting. I saw you counting the time with your hand on the armrest. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. He paused. "You still hear it, don't you?" Her head came all the way up then. Her eyes, gray, ringed in red, met his, and for a second she could not say anything at all. Because in 2 years and 4 months, no one had said the true thing to her, the thing under all the other things. And this stranger, in a worn suit, had walked across a room full of people who thought he was a waiter. and said it like it was obvious. "Who are you?" she whispered. It was not quite a question. It was closer to please. "Right now, I'm a man who'd like to ask you to dance," Keanu said. "Before anything else. Before you ask me how, before your mother asks me who I am, before that boy over there says something else stupid. I'd just like to be the first person tonight who asked you the way you should have been asked." He held out his hand, open, unhurried. "Eleanor, may I have this dance?" Behind the chair, Margaret Vandermeer made a small breaking sound. "I can't dance," Eleanor said. The words came out fast, defensive, a thing she had said so many times it had worn a groove. "In case you missed it, I can't, that's the whole. That's why no body." "I didn't ask if you could walk," Keanu said. "I asked if you'd dance. Those aren't the same question." They never were. People in this room think they're the same question. They're wrong, and I can show you they're wrong, but only if you put your hand in mine. The room had gone very quiet. The Chopin had trailed off. The conductor, an alert younger man named Daniel Mercer, had stopped the orchestra and was watching the kneeling man with a frown of half-recognition, as though a name were trying to surface, and had not quite broken through. Eleanor looked at the open hand. She looked at the stranger's face, and then her right hand, the one she still had, the one that always trembled a little now from the strange, rerouted tension of her body, lifted slowly from the armrest, like something rising from deep water, and she placed it in his. "Yes," she whispered. A gasp moved through the front tables. Brad Carmichael laughed, but the laugh came half a beat too late and a beat too thin, and none of his friends laughed with him, which a man like Brad notices faster than almost anything. From the side of the room, near the door, where she had just been wheeled in, came a sound. It was an old woman's voice, cracked and astonished, and it carried across the silent ballroom the way only an old voice can. "Oh," said Vera Holloway. "Oh, you came. You actually came." Keanu turned his head and found her at last 81 years old, tiny in her chair by the side entrance, one spotted hand pressed to her chest, her eyes streaming, and he smiled at her, the first full smile he had shown the room, and something in the smile told the sharper guests that whoever this man was, the guest of honor knew him. And the guest of honor was looking at him the way you look at family. "Mrs. Holloway," Keanu said, "I told you I'd sit in the back." "You are a liar," Vera said, laughing through the tears. "And you always were a terrible sitter. Now stop talking to me and do it properly, Daniel." She turned her head toward the conductor with 40 years of command still in her voice. "Young man, do you have a Strauss in you?" "The Vienna Woods." Slow, from the second figure. There was a history in that exchange the room could not see. 25 years earlier, a younger Keanu had come to Vera Holloway as a student, sent by a film he was preparing for, expecting to learn some steps and leave. Vera had taken one look at him and announced that he held his body like a man, apologizing for taking up space, and that she could not teach a man to dance until she taught him to stop apologizing. She had been merciless and funny and exactly right. Over 6 weeks, she had taught him the standing forms, and because Vera could not teach anything without teaching all of it, she had rolled a wheelchair into the center of her studio and told him to learn the other half of her life's work. The half nobody filmed, the half she cared about most. He had been clumsy at it at first. Everyone was. The instinct of a standing dancer is to do things to the chair, to push it and steer it, and treat it as a problem to be managed. And Vera had spent the better part of 2 weeks beating that instinct out of him. "The chair is not your problem to solve," she had said, again and again. "The chair is your partner's body. You would not shove your partner's spine around a floor. You listen to it. You feel where it wants to turn, and you make room for the turn. The chair has more grace in it than your legs ever will, if you will only stop fighting it." He had never forgotten that. He had used it exactly twice in 25 years. Both times privately, both times for someone who needed it more than any film ever had. Tonight was the third. Daniel Mercer's frown cleared all at once into open astonishment, because now the name had surfaced. Now he knew exactly who was kneeling on the floor of the Vandermeer ballroom, and he lifted his baton with hands that were not entirely steady. "Wait," Brad Carmichael said, too loud. Wait, this is somebody needs to. Mr. Vandermeer, you're going to let this, whoever this is, with your daughter in front of. Sit down, son. The voice was Coach Walter Sutton's, a broad, gray-haired man near the orchestra, who had been Vera's escort for the evening, and who had spent 26 years in the Marines before he ever spent a day coaching anything. He did not raise his voice. He did not have to. You've said enough for one night. Sit down and watch, and if you're lucky, someday you'll be able to tell people you were in the room. Brad sat down. He did not entirely know why. His body did it before his pride could vote. And across the ballroom at table 1, Theodore Vandermeer rose halfway out of his chair, his face the color of old paper, every instinct in him screaming to cross the floor and stop this, to protect his daughter from one more public spectacle, one more stranger with a theory, one more disappointment dressed up as hope. His wife caught his wrist. Theodore, Margaret said, look at her face. Theodore looked at his daughter's face, and he sat back down slowly because he had not seen that particular expression on Eleanor's face in 2 years and 4 months, and he was suddenly, desperately afraid of being the man who took it away. Keanu rose from his knee. He did not pull Eleanor's chair onto the floor like a prop. He moved himself around behind her and put one hand lightly on the push handles and leaned down close to her ear. Here's the truth, he said quietly, only for her. I am not going to fix you. I want to be clear about that before we start, because everyone who has come at you for 2 years has come carrying a fix, and I'm not one of them. Your legs are not going to do anything tonight they couldn't do this morning. That's not what this is. Then, what is it? Eleanor said, and there was fear in it now, the specific fear of a person being offered hope who has learned that hope is just a long way around to being disappointed again. This is a dance, Keanu said. A real one. There's a whole discipline you've never been told about. Because the people who told you what your life was now didn't think it was worth mentioning. People who use chairs dance. Competitively. Beautifully. There are world championships, Eleanor. It's called adaptive dance, or paradance, and there are people who have given their whole lives to it. There's a woman sitting by that door who spent 30 years of her life proving that the chair is not the end of the dance. The chair is the dance. It's a partner. It's an instrument. And she taught me a long time ago how to dance with it. He paused. Nobody in this room knows that's a thing. We're about to teach 400 people something they should already know. Including you, especially you. Why didn't anyone tell me? Eleanor said, and her voice cracked on it. Because the question was bigger than the dance. The question was about 2 years of being handed a life with half its doors painted over by people who had simply never thought to mention the doors were there. Because the people around you only knew how to grieve what you lost, Keanu said gently. Nobody handed you what you could still have. That's not always cruelty. Sometimes it's just a failure of imagination, but it costs the same either way. He paused. I can't give you back the morning before the fall. Nobody can. But I can give you the next song. That part's still yours. It was always still yours. Eleanor was quiet. Her hand had found the rim of her wheel without her deciding to put it there. The old reflex of a body that knew this machine better than the people watching could imagine. It's going to feel strange, Keanu said. You're going to want to apologize for the chair. Don't. The chair stays. The chair is invited. Can you trust me for one song? The first chord of Tales from the Vienna Woods rolled out across the parquet floor of Marchmont Hall, slow and warm, beginning like a sunrise. One song, Eleanor whispered. One song, Keanu said, and Eleanor, don't look at them. There's only us and the count. 1, 2, 3. Hear it? Let your shoulders go first. The chair will follow. It always follows the shoulders. He came back around to her front, took both her hands, set his feet, and on the second bar of the estrats, he began to move, and the wheelchair, under the lightest pressure of his hands and the turn of her own shoulders, began, very slowly, to dance. What happened on the floor of Marchmont Hall over the next 4 minutes was not a miracle. That is the important thing to understand, because the room kept waiting for a miracle. Kept holding its breath for the moment the girl would rise from the chair and walk. And that moment never came, and the absence of it was the most beautiful part, though it would take some of the 400 a long time to understand why. Keanu danced with the chair, not against it. This is the thing about adaptive ballroom that the 400 guests did not know and were about to learn. A wheelchair, in the hands of a dancer who respects it, is not a limitation to be overcome. It is a partner with its own grammar. It pivots on an axis a standing dancer does not have. It can turn inside a space a standing couple needs twice the room for. It can hold a line, hold a stillness, then break into a spin that no pair of legs can match. Vera Holloway had spent 30 years teaching the world that the chair does not subtract from the dance. It adds a vocabulary. You just simply have to learn the words. Keanu knew the words. He set his right hand lightly on Eleanor's shoulder blade and kept his left in her hand, and he let her shoulders lead, and the chair answered. And on the second rotation, Eleanor stopped bracing for catastrophe long enough to feel what was actually happening, which was that she was dancing. Not pretending to dance, not being pitied through a slow shuffle, dancing with a partner who knew exactly how much weight to give and how much to take, who moved the way water moves around a stone, close enough to guide, never so close as to push. She had forgotten what it felt like. That was the thing that undid her, somewhere in the second rotation, the thing she had not let herself think about in 2 years. She had not just lost the walking. She had lost this, the specific feeling of moving with another person to music, of two bodies negotiating a shared count, the oldest conversation there is. She had decided that feeling belonged to the body she used to have, and she had buried it with the rest, and now here it was again, intact, exactly as she remembered it, available to the body she had now, and the discovery that it had never actually left, that it had only been waiting on the far side of a door no one had told her she was allowed to open, broke something loose 2 years and 4 months, that had been frozen all solid for 2 There it is, Keanu said quietly, when he felt her shoulders finally drop into the count, when the bracing went out of her arms. There you are. You never forgot. Your body's been holding the count for 2 years with nowhere to spend it. How did you know? She breathed. How did you know I still? Because you can't unlearn the count, Keanu said. Vera told me that 25 years ago. She said the steps leave, but the count never does. She said that's why the work is possible at all. You teach the body new ways to spend a rhythm it never stopped keeping. He turned them through a slow arc, the chair pivoting clean beneath her. You've been keeping it this whole time. I just watched your hand on the armrest and saw you hadn't stopped. Eleanor made a sound that was half a laugh, and half something that had been locked in her chest for 2 years and 4 months. It came out short and stunned, and it was the first time she had laughed in public since the morning of the fall. Her mother heard it. Margaret Vandermeer pressed both hands to her face and made a sound of her own, and began to laugh and weep at the same time, gripping the back of an empty chair to stay upright. She had spent 2 years watching the brightness in her daughter go out like a candle in a draft, had prayed for it to come back in 100 churches and a dozen specialists' offices. And here it was, returning not through any of the doors she had hammered on, but through one she had not known existed, opened by a stranger she had mistaken, an hour ago, for a waiter. By the side door, Vera Holloway was on her feet. She should not have been. Her own legs barely held her these days, and her attendant reached to stop her, and then did not, because there are moments you do not interrupt. She stood, one hand on her cane, the other pressed flat over her heart. And she watched a man she had taught a quarter of a century ago do the thing she had given her whole life to, in a ballroom full of people who had never once thought to learn it, and the tears ran down into the powder she had put on that afternoon, and she whispered, to no one, that's it. That's the frame. He kept the frame. It was more than she had dared hope for when she wrote the letter. Vera had not asked Keanu to dance. She had asked him to come and sit in the back, to let an old woman see a friendly face one more time before the rooms ran out. She had not known about the girl, not really. Had not let herself imagine that the student from years ago, the one who had gone over the rail at the riding event, would be at this ball. would be sitting at the edge of this very floor, being refused by a parade of cowards. If she had known, she might have warned him, or she might have done exactly what she did, which was watch the man she trusted most in the world look at a room, find the one person in it who had been written off, and cross the floor without being asked. She had taught him the steps. She had not taught him that. That had always been his. Keanu brought the chair through a slow turn, and Eleanor's silver gown opened around the wheels like a flower, and the chandeliers caught in her dark hair. And for the first time all night, 400 people were looking at her, and she was not furniture. She was the most alive thing in the room. On the far side of the floor, Brad Carmichael said to anyone who would listen, "This is staged. This has to be staged." Nobody turned to look at him. Nobody had to. The not turning was its own verdict. But Brad could not let it be. That was the thing about a man performing his worst self for an audience. When the audience turned away, the performance did not stop, it escalated. Because the whole point of it had been the audience. And an audience walking away felt, to Brad, like the floor giving out. He pushed up from his chair and started toward the dancers, his voice climbing. "She can't even, look at her. This is some kind of. Somebody's going to get hurt. This is insane." He moved with his hand half raised, as though he meant to take hold of the chair, to stop the dance, to drag the evening back to the version of reality in which he had been right about Eleanor Vandermeer. He did not get within 10 feet of her. Coach Walter Sutton stepped into his path, the way a wall steps into a path. 6'3", gray-haired, 26 years in the Marine Corps, before he ever blew a whistle on a practice field, and he closed one large hand around Brad's forearm with a gentleness that was somehow more frightening than force would have been. "Son," he said very quietly, so quietly that only Brad and the two nearest tables could hear it. "You're going to stop now. Get your hand off me." "My father, do you know who my—" "Get off." "I know exactly who your father is," Sutton said. "He's the man sitting over there pretending he doesn't know you. And I want you to listen to me, because I'm only going to say this once, and then you're going to spend a long time deciding whether you understood it." His grip did not tighten. It did not have to. "There is a young lady dancing for the first time in 2 years. That is the most important thing that has happened in this room in a decade, and possibly the most important thing that will ever happen it. And you want to walk into the middle of it because you cannot stand to be wrong out loud. That's all this is. You'd rather wreck something beautiful than let it prove you were a coward. I've seen men do worse for the same reason, in worse places than this. It never once made them less of a coward. It just made the damage bigger." He let go of Brad's arm, finger by finger. "Sit down. Watch rest of it. And if there's anything left in you worth saving, let it teach you something." Brad looked the coach to where his father sat, and his father did not meet his eyes. And that, more than the coach, more than the silent room, was what put Brad Carmichael back in his chair. He sat down. He did not say another word for the rest of the night. Whether anything in him was worth saving, the story does not pretend to know. Some of these things take a whole life to find out, and most of the finding happens long after the ballroom empties. Keanu had not looked over once. He had heard it, the raised voice, the scuffle, the way you hear weather through a wall, and he had trusted Walter Sutton to be the wall, and he had kept his eyes on Eleanor the entire time, because the single most important thing he could do for her in that moment was to not look away, make her feel that whatever was happening at the edges of the room, here, in the center, in the count, nothing had still. In Singe, the dance was still the dance. She was still safe inside it. She felt it. She would tell him, much later, that the thing she remembered most was not the spin or the applause, but the fact that when the trouble came, he had not even glanced at it, that for 4 minutes she had been the only thing in the world a man was looking at. And how long it had been, how impossibly long, since she had been the only thing anyone was looking at for a good reason. Keanu leaned in close as the music rose into the famous climbing phrase of the Vienna woods. "Eleanor, there's a figure I want to try. You're going to do a spin on your own axis, and I'm going to let go of you for 2 beats. Just 2. The chair will hold the turn by itself if you commit your shoulders to it. I'll be right here on the third beat. You're going to let go for 2 beats. You can do this part without me. That's the whole point. He held her eyes. Everybody in your life for 2 years has been holding on to you so tight you couldn't move. I'm going to do the opposite. I'm going to let go on purpose. Because I know you can do it. And I want you to find out you can do it in front of every person who decided you couldn't. 3, 2, 1, and turn. He let go. For 2 beats of the Vienna woods, Eleanor Vandermeer spun alone on the floor of her own birthday ball, the chair pivoting clean on its axis, under the command of her own shoulders, her arms open. Her face lifted, no hands holding her, no one bracing her, alone and upright and turning, and the room caught its breath because it finally understood that she was not being danced. She was dancing. And on the third beat, Keanu's hand was there exactly as promised, and the turn resolved, and the dance went on. That was the moment the applause wanted to start. Keanu felt it gathering at the edges of the room, and he held up 2 fingers, low, without looking away from Eleanor, and the room understood and held itself off, because the song was not finished, and you do not applaud a thing that is not finished. They danced the Vienna woods all the way to its resolving chord, and on the last phrase, Keanu brought the chair into the final figure Vera had taught him a quarter-century ago, a long, slow-supported lean, his hand cradling the back of Eleanor's shoulders. The chair tilted just slightly back on its rear axis in a line that mirrored exactly the backward lean of a standing dancer in her partner's arms. The silver gown spilling toward the floor, and he held it, and the orchestra held the chord, and held it, and held it. Then he brought her up. The chord resolved. And Eleanor Vandermeer sat in the center of the ballroom of Marchmont Hall, in her wheelchair, breathing hard, her face wet and shining and absolutely alive, having just danced for the first time in 2 years and 4 months. The first person to applaud was Vera Holloway, 81 years old, standing without her cane. The second was Theodore Vandermeer, who was already weeping and did not care who saw. The third was every soul in that room, and the applause did not stop for a long time. Eleanor turned her face up to Keanu's, and over the noise of 400 people she said something only he could hear. I forgot I was still in here. She pressed her hand flat over her own heart, over the silver gown. I know, Keanu said. I could see you in there the whole time. Welcome back. Now here is where the story refuses you the clean ending, because real endings are never symmetric. Brad Carmichael did not get a redemption scene, and he did not get destroyed either. Not the way the room half wanted. He sat at his table while his friends drifted to other tables, one by one, the way people edge away from someone who has become radioactive. And at some point in the next hour he left alone, and no one stopped him or said goodbye. The next morning the video would be online, because a guest at table 6 had filmed the whole dance, and Brad went to bad Fuse Altfix as the most disliked young man in Georgia. His name attached to a clip that several million people watched specifically to feel the satisfaction of watching the kind boy win and the cruel boy lose. But he was not expelled from existence. His father did not lose an election by 22 points. His father was not even a politician, only a wealthy man who measured things in advantage and liability, and who was privately more annoyed by the public embarrassment than moved by anything it revealed. Brad transferred to a college in another state where the clip was less famous. He told a version of the story in which he had been ambushed, set up, made to look bad by a celebrity stunt, and he found, as people usually do, a small circle willing to believe the version that cost them nothing. He never, as far as anyone knew, said he was sorry, not to Eleanor, not to anyone. That is the part the story will not soften, because softening it would be a lie. Some people do not get the lesson. They get the version of events that lets them sleep, and they move into it, and they live there. And the rest of us are left with the uncomfortable truth that cruelty does not always collapse on cue. Sometimes it just walks out a side door and finds a new town. And Eleanor did not get up out of the chair and walk. She never would. The injury was the injury. The doctors had not been wrong about her spine, only about her life. Keanu had told her the truth at the start, that he was not going to fix her, and he had kept it. And that kept truth turned out to be the most valuable thing anyone had given her in 2 years, more valuable than all the second opinions. Because it was the first time anyone had offered her something real, instead of something hoped for. The people who had loved her most had spent 2 years accidentally telling her, with every fresh specialist and every prayer for a miracle, that her life could not truly begin again until she stood. Keanu had told her the opposite. Her life had never stopped. It had only been waiting for her to be invited back into it. And the invitation, it turned out, did not require her legs at all. Let me tell you where everyone landed, because real endings are never symmetric. Eleanor Vandermeer crossed the floor when the applause finally faded and stood in front of Keanu, and for the first time the room saw recognition move across the powerful man's face. The slow dawning understanding of exactly who had walked into his ballroom unannounced and been mistaken for the help. He had spent the evening so consumed with his daughter that he had never once looked closely at the man in the worn suit, had filed him, like everyone else, under nobody. And now the filing collapsed, and Theodore understood that one of the most recognizable men alive had been standing at the back of his ballroom for an hour, while 400 of Theodore's guests assumed he was staff. The understanding humbled him in a way very little had in 30 years. He started to speak and could not, and then he did something no one in his bloodline had done in 3 generations. He put out his hand, and when Keanu took it, Theodore covered both their hands with his other one and held on like a man holding a railing. "I don't know how to thank you," he said. "You gave her back something 12 doctors couldn't." "The doctors gave her the truth about her spine," Keanu said. "They just forgot to tell her she still had a life. That's not a medical thing. That part you don't need a specialist for. You just need somebody to ask her to dance." He paused and looked over at Vera, small and triumphant by the door. "And you need somebody to have taught you how. Don't thank me. There's the woman who spent her whole life on this so that tonight could happen. Thank her. And then fund her, because the discipline that just gave your daughter back to you is run on almost nothing by people the world ignores." Theodore Vandermeer did both. He went to Vera Holloway that night, and he knelt by her chair the way Keanu had knelt by his daughter's, and whatever he said to her stayed between them. But Vera was crying when he stood up, and so was he. That spring, the Vandermeer Foundation endowed a national program for adaptive dance, named for Vera Holloway, the first of its kind at that scale in the country. It funded coaches. It bought sprung floors for community centers in towns that had never had one. It put the discipline Vera had spent 30 years building, quietly, on almost nothing, with almost no recognition, into rooms all over the country where people in chairs had been told, the way Eleanor had been told, that dancing was a country whose borders were now closed to them. Vera spent the last years of her life watching that program grow. She had given 30 years to a thing the world had mostly declined to notice, and in the end, she got to watch it noticed, which is more than most people who give their lives to quiet work ever receive. She died 2 years later. At her memorial, there were dancers in wheelchairs, dozens of them, students of students of students, and they danced, and it was not sad. And Keanu was there in the back, in a worn dark suit, where the interesting people always are. Eleanor began adaptive dance properly that spring, with a real coach from Vera's program, not Keanu, because Keanu had been very clear that he was a door, not a destination, that his job had been to walk across one room one time and show her the door existed, and that the walking through was hers to do with people who did this every day. She did not become a champion overnight, and the story will not pretend she did. She lost more than she won at first, the way anyone does. And there were nights she wanted to quit, nights the chair felt like a cage again, and the old grief came back and sat on her chest. But she had something now that the accident had taken and the dance had given back, which was a place to put the wanting. The wanting that had sat in her chest for 2 years with nowhere to go finally had somewhere to go. She went on to study disability law. She testified years later before a state committee on accessibility in public space from her chair, And she did not apologize for the chair once, because a man in a worn suit had taught her, in 4 minutes, that the chair was invited. The video reached several million people. It did not, in the end, become a story about a celebrity, because Keanu would not let it. He gave one short statement and never expanded on it. It said, "The remarkable thing in that room was not me. It was a discipline that has existed for decades that none of those 400 people had ever heard of, and a girl who never stopped hearing the music. Look up adaptive dance." That's the story. He pointed everyone, every time, back to Vera's program, and to Eleanor, and away from himself, and after a while the press gave up, trying to make it about him, and let it but about the thing he kept insisting it was about, which was the truest measure of the man, if you were paying attention. Margaret Vandermeer learned to stop hovering. That was her own quiet arc, the one nobody filmed. She had spent 2 years standing behind her daughter's chair, braced her to catch her, and she had to learn, slowly and against every instinct, to drive Eleanor to practice, and then sit in the car and let her go in alone, to let her daughter wobble and lose and fail, and get back up without a mother's hands reaching in to soften it, because Margaret had finally understood, watching a stranger let go of her daughter for 2 beats in the middle of a ballroom, that the holding on she had mistaken for love had also been a kind of cage. It was the hardest thing she ever learned. She learned it. The closing scene is a small one, a year on. It is the anniversary of the ball, and there is no ball this time, just a practice studio across town, with a sprung floor and bad fluorescent lighting and a sound system that crackles. Eleanor is there in her training chair, running a figure she cannot quite get, the same 8 bars over and over, frustrated, sweating, ordinary. A man in a worn dark jacket lets himself in at the back and sits on a folding chair against the wall and watches without saying anything, the way he watched a ballroom a year ago. From the edge, where the interesting people always are. Eleanor sees him in the mirror. She does not stop the music. She finishes the figure, badly, and turns her chair to face him, breathing hard. "You're late," she says. "I'm a terrible sitter," Keanu says. "Mrs. Holloway used to tell me that. Run it again. Your shoulders are leading too early. Let the count get to 3 before you commit." And she runs it again, and outside the bad windows the ordinary city goes on, full of rooms where someone has decided someone else is furniture. And somewhere in this one, a girl in a chair is learning, one bad 8-bar figure at a time, that she wasn't furniture at all. I keep coming back to the chair. Not the dance, not the spin, not the moment the whole room finally stood up. The chair. It was still there at the end of the song. That is the part I cannot stop thinking about. We have a story we like to tell, all of us, about nights like that one. And in our version, the girl rises out of the chair and caulks, because we have decided that the chair is the tragedy and standing is the happy ending. Keanu Reeves walked into that ballroom and refused to tell that story. He did not lift Eleanor Vandermeer out of her chair. He danced with her in it, and he called it what it was, which was not a tragedy and not a miracle but a partnership, a thing with its own grammar that 4 people had simply never bothered to learn. He gave her back her own life, without asking her to leave any part of it behind, including the part that rolled. And I think that is the harder kind of love, and the rarer kind, and the kind almost nobody in that room would have known how to offer, because it does not get to end with everyone gasping as someone walks. It ends with someone dancing exactly as they are. That is the part that stays with me. While this story is fictional, the lessons about who we decide is still allowed to be fully alive, and who we quietly write off, are very real. Thank you for following this story. Let us know in the comments below. If this story has moved you and you'd like to stand with us in bringing more voices of truth and hope to light, please consider supporting our work. Even the smallest gift helps us continue creating and sharing these powerful stories. You can find the donate link in the description. And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next chapter we're preparing for you.